It's been 10 years since I last read one of my favourite books of all time, Magician by Raymond E. Feist. I've always regarded this book as a 5-star read, so I decided to read it again recently and see if that was still the case. I like reading fantasy because I really enjoy the imagination. I like exploring these worlds that the authors create. Now, Magician is more idyllic fantasy than grimdark. Grimdark has become quite popular in recent times, but I think the fact that it's idyllic is a positive. I don't enjoy reading about horrific wounds. I don't enjoy reading about characters being tortured. And because Magician is idyllic fantasy, it doesn't have any of these things. Here's what I liked about Magician. When I first read it, it was the first epic fantasy book that I'd ever read. It really opened my eyes into what world building was possible within a novel. There's different kingdoms, different languages, different politics, different religions, and it still ticks all those boxes today. Also, for a high fantasy book, it doesn't drag on overly. That's often a sort of Achilles heel for these novels. There are a few sections where it does that, but as a whole, it doesn't really drag on. I also quite like that Magician is 3 distinct parts. There's Pug as a boy, Pug once he becomes captured, and then there's sort of the grand finale which links the two together. Something else that I quite like about Magician is it's not a copy on the typical fantasy tropes. I think a lot of these come from Lord of the Rings just because it was so successful for its time and it really ushered in fantasy and sort of what the bar was. So in Magician, there's no evil Dark Lord who's just evil. It never really gets explained why they are evil. There's no chosen one. There's no prophecy. There's no magical object that has to be found and destroyed or reunited with someone. And lastly, the invading country, who I guess are the bad guys in this book, they're not even evil. Like, the reason they're invading is very logical. It makes sense. But I did notice some things that changed on my reread. So, firstly, the dialogue. I actually was listening to this part of Magician on an audiobook, and it was really noticeable here that at times it did become a bit stilted.
To the slave, he said, "If you're to serve here, you need a kingdom name." The slave looked about and then gave a curt nod. Longbow said, "Call him Charles. It's as close a name as I can imagine." Aruta said, "As good a name as any."
Once I noticed that for the first time, I sort of just kept noticing it. I'm quite a quick reader, so I find it easy to ignore these things, but once I noticed it, that wasn't the case, and it sort of stuck out like a sore thumb to me. There is one slower section. It's in the middle of the book, and I don't know how much is because it's slower and how much is because I just really like the book and I knew what was coming and I was a bit impatient to get to that point. But the one thing that irked me the most was the characterization of Aglarena, the Elf Queen. So Aglarena is centuries old. She's the sole monarch of the Elvish kingdom. She's probably one of the most powerful people in this world. And then at some point, she becomes romantically involved with a human male who's a teenager, which is weird to start with. But what's worse is that as the book progresses, she becomes increasingly dependent and increasingly submissive to this partner. And I actually noticed that this seems to be a bit of a trend with the other female characters in Magician. So if you've read Magician, let me know. Did you find the same thing? And if you did, what do you think of it? I wonder what the critical reception to Magician would be if it was released today, because this book was first released 39 years ago, and so the standard has changed quite a bit since then. Okay, the wrap up. Let me be clear, the good in Magician definitely outweighs the bad. For me, it's still a 5-star read, but if I was being honest with myself, and this was the first time I was reading it, I'd give it 4 out of 5. I think if you like high fantasy, it's a solid read and you'll definitely enjoy it. But if you're a bit hesitant because of some of the downsides I mentioned, there's 2 other novels by Raymond E. Feist that I recommend you read first. Daughter of the Empire has a female protagonist and it's co-authored with Jenny Wirtz. Talon of the Silver Hawk was written 20 years after Magician, so Feist has got another 20 years to practice and master his craft and sort of iron out the kinks. So that wraps things up. It's a 4 out of 5 star read. If you like high fantasy, go for it. I'm going to post a written review for this on my Instagram and on my website, and I've also got a Twitter if you want to keep in touch. Have you read Magician? If you have, let me know what you think. Do you think I missed some things? I'd also be really keen to know, how old were you when you first read Magician? And how many times have you read it since then? Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you on the next one.